Jason McCrossan on
106.9 SFM.
And I'm pleased to say I have Dr James Treadwell on the phone now. James is from Birmingham City University, who's undertaking research for a number of crime and criminal justice related projects, including a long-term study of the English Defence League, a subject I wouldn't mind coming back to and discussing at a later date. Dr Treadwell, good afternoon.
Afternoon, Jason.
Now, I remember working in a bar called the Old Goa in Ealing in 1999 when the news flashed up on the TV screens that Jill Dando had been killed. And I remember wondering, first of all, who would do that sort of thing? Why? But also thinking, I'll probably know in a couple of years. I'll probably know in a year. I'll probably find out. And I was trying to work out what my reaction would be when I found out who it was, assuming that the police would have solved it. They haven't. Have you come across many cases like this before?
The Jill Dando case is an extremely rare case. I mean, for such a high-profile, well-known celebrity to be killed in broad daylight on her doorstep in the middle of the day, very public setting. I mean, that is spectacularly rare, and in many ways, slightly like yourself, you would sort of quickly imagine, in many ways, that the police would have solved that crime. That it would be very easy to solve, and in actual fact, the fact that today it remains sort of mired in controversy is pretty spectacular, and I think it's one of those sort of emblematic murders in the UK that will sort of remain in some ways very shrouded in mystery, although different people are now quite divided on what they think actually happened. So for example, Nick Ross in his book on crime, certainly it leads to, he gives a very strong opinion on what he think went on and who he thinks the perpetrator was. And indeed, Barry George was initially convicted and then subsequently that conviction was quashed. But it remains...
Sorry, who does Nick... Are you able to say who Nick thinks it is?
Well, I think if you read Nick's book, I think much of that in his book on crime is in many ways a suggestion that he doesn't think that the investigation was all that flawed, and therefore I think without saying who he thinks it is and attributing it to him, I think it's quite clear. I was never entirely convinced of the line with Barry George, and I think there are a number of features of the Jill Dando case that make it pretty exceptional and make it in some ways quite hard to believe that a man who was in many ways in life very, very disorganised would have committed that murder. And I think all of the hallmarks of the Dando case, some of the most interesting features are just how organised, planned and in some ways sort of well executed it seems to have been. And I think that leads you towards another conclusion, which is that whoever the perpetrator was, or whomever the perpetrators were, I think in many ways, because of that sort of degree of organisation, they might prove very, very difficult to bring to justice. Yeah,
and the police kind of went down this Barry George route, and on what seemed like flimsy evidence, really the thing that got him, and the thing that they managed to convince a jury about, from the little reading that I've done of it, to be fair, was the fact that he had gunpowder residue in his pocket, and that was the main thing.
Yeah, I mean, he's a very odd character who...
There's lots of them, to be fair.
Absolutely, who was previously known to the police. But one of the things that's always, I think, for a number of criminologists, one of the things that's always struck is that, in many ways, George's life is very sort of chaotic and disorganised. And when you look at the type of person that would be able to perpetrate such a serious crime without leaving any sort of forensic evidence, without leaving a trail of sort of evidence of what they'd done, without sort of being witnessed. That strikes us as quite hard to believe in some ways. And so I've certainly always thought that in many ways that many of the facts of the case jar with the man Barry George and his life and his background. Of course, one of the things that did happen, and this is something that has happened on several occasions where the police have failed in investigative terms, and I can think of several other cases. The murder of Rachel Nickell is another one. They become very, very convinced that they have the right person in mind, and then sort of scale down their investigations based on this supposition that they have the right person. And of course, the problem with that is that in many ways it limits lines of inquiry, and once sort of sources go dead, the further you get away from the facts, the immediacy of the investigation, the harder it is then at some point to see it solved subsequently in the future.
The Mirror have quite a good look at the Jill Dando case. They've got their journalist Mark William Thomas on it, and one of the things that they look at, a number of the theories as to why she was killed, range from being a hitman ordered by London's prominent crime families, the Serbian mafia, the IRA. Jill was trying to expose a paedophile ring. Whatever the reason, and this, I suppose, almost brings us back to the Barry George loner situation, which is, if it was one of these people, if it wasn't done by a loner, so if it was done by a group, why wouldn't that have got out somehow through the grapevine, through someone talking to someone who talks to their cousin, who gossips to someone else, who then chats to the butcher? It would have got out, wouldn't it, if it had been a conspiracy, as some people think?
I think that's a very good point, and that's one of the things in some ways for me that stands against it being a conspiracy, or a sort of conspiracy suggested of particularly the sort of organised crime groups in some ways, because people do talk and people do sort of, for the most part, open up. Of course, that's slightly different because some of the suggestions and some of the connections, if we were talking about, for example, and it was heavily sort of mooted at the time, including by those charged with defending Barry George, that there could have been some connection back to the Serbian state. If that were to be the case, the individuals involved there may be sort of much more sort of professional and organised, and then perhaps the possibility of talk coming out and people becoming aware is limited. Though the fact that the suggestion is there suggests that there was some sort of chatter, even if it was quite limited. I think that is one of the problems generally that comes about when such things happen. And people do largely talk and things do come to light. But of course, the other side of it is that with all of the hallmarks, and why some of those sort of suggestions are easier to believe, is with everything that we do know about the Dando case and the degree of sort of planning and sophistication that seems to have gone into it, and the sort of brutal and ruthless execution, it would suggest that it was certainly individuals that were more sort of sophisticated than the weirdo loner, and again, that certainly casts the case into doubt. Of course, the problem is that the further you go from the immediacy of an event, in many ways, the harder it becomes then to go back and retrace and investigate historically, because people's memories fail, things that may have been seen that at the time that could have come out, that could have potentially been useful, get forgotten to the past, and it becomes far harder. The important thing with criminal investigation is the early days are essential, and in many ways now, the chances of that ever being solved without someone sort of confessing to it or new information coming to light is perhaps very, very limited.
when you look at the case, the Jill Dando case, because the other thing is she wasn't at that house very often, so it looked like it had to have been sort of organised in some way, so that they knew that she would be at that house. It does, like you say, lead to being slightly more organised rather than that loner. Whatever the case might be, it just, are you aware of any other cases, high-profile cases like this, where the suspect just hasn't been found? And there's no leads, and the police just don't have a clue, basically.
I can think of other cases, and there are a few that you can think of. In particular, I mean, some of the sort of most infamous cases in the UK's history, including, for example, I'm a Birmingham boy. You know, the Birmingham pub bombings, and until the recent attacks on London, the largest bombings to have occurred on mainland UK. No one has ever been held responsible. It was only in 2014 that the Irish Republican Army actually admitted that, you know, that they were involved, although never officially. It was only through a person who was connected to that. So you do get cases where in particular there are miscarriages of justice, where they seemingly sort of pass into history, and they aren't necessarily picked up in that sort of immediacy, investigated and then solved. So it does happen, but the thing that we ought to remember is that those are really, really exceptional cases. And one of the things that always fascinates me is when I first encounter criminology students, I tend to ask them, one of the questions I ask them is, you know, what percentage in any given year of murders do the police solve? And they massively, disproportionately estimate a low number. They tend to say 10%, 15%, whereas... Can I have a go? Yeah, of course.
So I would say, I'm going to say around about 60%.
Again, actually, too low, around over 90%. And when I then ask them, why do the police solve all these murders? Why are they so good at doing it? They then sort of say, well, it's DNA evidence. It's whereas in actuality, the fact of the matter is that most murders are committed by somebody who's known to the victim. When the blood is up in temper, and disproportionately they tend to be the murder of individuals' children, or their domestic homicides, or their young men who are known to one another in the streets with knives, broken bottles, and that leads to murder convictions. So most murders aren't particularly difficult or hard to solve. They're not that complex. Of course, the thing with that is there are a small number, very small number, where they are incredibly complex crimes, and it's those ones that, in particular, you know, the authorities will tend to find more difficult. And so, in the case of Jill Dando, though, of course, the police are allocated budgets in part dependent on the profile of the victim and how alarming that case necessarily is, and therefore, in the case of Jill Dando, a massive amount of money and resource went into that investigation, and therefore it's understandable why, for some, there's a suggestion that perhaps it was never so cut and dry as George's acquittal might seem to make it. But and
that was going to be my next question, to be honest, was about how much blame should we put on the police for, in a sense, I mean, are we okay? Can we say they bodged it? Can they say it was a bodged job?
I think it's really, really complicated because we simply don't know. I mean, with time and hindsight, it's very, very easy to say, you know, that seemingly there were things that went wrong in that investigation. But hindsight is sometimes a wonderful thing, and there are certainly instances where the police are concerned, I think, where we could be much more critical than when it comes to some murder investigations. You know, the nature of investigating serious crime sometimes is things will go wrong, evidence will be missed, opportunities will be missed, and you know, we can see that in a number of cases historically, whether it be police officers coming to a serial killer's door while he's involved in the act of attacking someone, through to failures to investigate some crimes properly, particularly because of perhaps all manner of different factors that are very easy to criticise in hindsight. That said, at the moment in particular, the police are under a period perhaps as an institution of fairly sustained critical scrutiny, and that's not just about sort of recent days where we've seen instances such as Hillsborough, but there have been a number of pretty damning instances involving the police that have perhaps shaken public faith in them a little bit.
I want to try to squeeze in one more question, if I can, James, just before we go. So Jill Dando happened in 1999. Given the developments in technology, in DNA sampling, and all the way we've got all the methods that we have of collecting evidence, and we've got to be about 20 seconds on this. Do you think Jill Dando, another celebrity, for example, of Jill Dando's stature, could be murdered on the streets of London again, and the killer get away with it, in effect?
I think it's unlikely. I think that will be a sort of era-defining crime in some ways. But I think in many ways that was an exceptional offence at an exceptional time, and I think it's very, very unlikely now.
Well, James, listen, thank you very much indeed for your time this afternoon, and I'd love to catch up with you about the English Defence League.
Yeah, sure, no problems. Anytime, Jason.